Michael and Ruth are a married couple. They are teaming up for a wilderness expedition. This time, the couple has come to the Amazon rainforest, which spans over 7.8 million square kilometers. They are located 13 kilometers away from the main channel of the Amazon River. Michael plans to first locate a tributary, craft a raft, and return to civilization. They head towards a lower-lying area and find a small stream before noon. Following the direction of the floating leaves, the couple walks downstream. After more than half an hour, Michael notices the sunlight ahead becoming exceptionally bright, indicating an open area. Indeed, they come across a wider river channel, deep enough for rafting, which will take several hours to build. Now, they decide to stop and rest to replenish their energy. Michael chooses a clear space near the river, planning to use nearby trees as posts to construct an elevated shelter. Ruth's task is to gather enough palm leaves. Michael cuts down a large amount of wood, using vines from the rainforest as ropes. He uses one of the tree trunks as a post, with the other 3 posts being live trees. He constructs a platform over 2 meters off the ground. While helping Ruth collect palm leaves, he finds a land tortoise on the ground, a perfect source of protein. The tortoise's meat is edible, and its shell can be used to boil water, making it an excellent survival tool. Then, Michael builds a single-pitched roof on the platform, covering it from bottom to top with the leaves of the elephant ear palm, completing the shelter. After being bitten by mosquitoes all night in the rainforest, Michael wears a helmet camera the next day to go hunting, as Ruth does not want to eat the cute tortoise. Just when Michael thinks he might return empty-handed, he spots a python on the forest floor. He pins the snake's head down with a stick and grabs it by the neck. The snake weighs about 10 kilograms, enough to release the tortoise and have a big meal. Since they haven't made fire yet, Michael stores the snake in his shirt to keep it. Next, he focuses on making fire. Michael finds a bamboo grove, cuts down some dry bamboo, and returns to camp to make water storage jars and a container for boiling water. He plans to use the fire saw method, splitting a bamboo in half, scraping bamboo shavings for tinder, cutting a groove in the bamboo piece for friction, placing the tinder behind a hole in the groove, and securing it with a small stick. Finally, he vigorously rubs the 2 bamboo pieces together. However, due to the rainforest's humidity, they struggle to produce sparks, so they lie flat and complain. Later, Michael finds a flammable resin, scrapes some into the tinder, and rubs for another half hour until the tinder finally smokes. He blows a few breaths and a flame bursts forth. They drink clean, boiled water and kill the python. They take it to the river, skin it, clean the insides, and discard the parts with parasites, keeping a large chunk of edible meat. That night, they stayed by the campfire, roasting snake meat. The thoroughly cooked snake meat tasted surprisingly like chicken, with a smoky flavor that was very aromatic. Michael and Ruth had a full meal and slept comfortably. On the 3rd day of survival, it was time to consider leaving the rainforest. Michael found several balsa trees, which are light and buoyant, making them ideal for raft making. He easily chopped down a balsa tree as thick as a soccer ball. At the same time, Ruth stripped the inner fibers of the bark. They cut the balsa wood into 5 sections, arranged them into a raft shape, and used the bark as rope to tie everything together. The balsa raft had strong buoyancy, enough to support the weight of Michael and Ruth. They floated downstream on the raft, passing through the jungle to the main channel of the Amazon River. Occasionally, they saw other boats on the river, marking the end of their challenge successfully. In the next episode, Michael and Ruth are lost in the Okavango Delta in Botswana, Africa. The area looks beautiful, but is full of dangers, as the nearest people are 80 kilometers away. They must stay and wait for rescue, equipped with only 2 machetes and some car parts. In other places, they would start by making a fire, but in Africa, they first made long spears for protection. Then they found a brush tree, suitable for making fire with its dry and soft branches. Rubbing by hand was hard, so Michael carved a groove at the top of the spindle and cut a shoelace. He removed the inner core made of 7 thin cords, tied loops on both ends, and hooked his thumbs through them. He placed the cord in the spindle's groove for easier and more efficient drilling. After half an hour, Michael successfully drilled out embers and lit the prepared tinder, creating a large fire. Many wild animals fear fire, and it protected Michael and Ruth from potential attacks. With a few minutes of daylight left, they cut a bunch of long grass from nearby to use as a mattress in their vehicle. safely spending their first night of survival. The next day, Michael planned to find food, obtain fresh water, and strengthen their camp. He took the battery box and the radiator water tank from the car to use as containers. At the lake near their camp, Michael kept watch for animals while Ruth bent down to collect water. Although the water looked clear, it was contaminated by hippos and crocodiles, so they needed to boil it for 5 minutes before drinking. After cleaning and cooling the water in plastic bottles, Michael and Ruth quenched their thirst and focused on finding food. Michael's hunting strategy was to follow animal tracks. Along the way, he saw many large bones and eventually found a recently deceased hartebeest under some bushes, likely killed by a lion. Ruth wanted to leave, but Michael saw it as a great foraging opportunity, guessing the lion had left to drink water and rest. They decided to use this time to cut and take the hartebeest's thigh. Ruth was assigned to cut the leg while Michael kept watch with a spear. The hartebeest's thick skin made the task difficult. Soon, birds in the trees began to chirp, a warning that large animals might be approaching. Under extreme tension, Ruth gave up, so Michael quickly cut off the hartebeest leg with a knife. Ruth started by slicing the skin and cutting off a large piece of fresh red meat, which would be their dinner. They hung the remaining parts in a tree, hoping other carnivores would not reach them. Before eating, Michael and Ruth had to fortify their camp. They mimicked local natives by cutting a large amount of acacia with long thorns to create a protective barrier. Michael then dismantled the car's front grill to use as a grill over the fire. By the time the meat was cooked, it was dark. This was their first meal in 2 days. The dense, juicy hartebeest meat was delicious. Every bite provided them with much-needed calories. That night, they had everything they needed for a comfortable sleep: food, drink, and protection against insects and predators. Unfortunately, on the 3rd day, they woke to bad news. The meat hung in the tree had been eaten by animals, forcing them to search for food again. This time, they encountered a nest of aggressive African bees hidden in a narrow tree crevice. After careful consideration, Michael decided not to risk it. They returned to the lake to look for food. Michael spotted a small crocodile under the water. Quietly approaching from behind, he grabbed and held the crocodile's neck tightly. Back on shore, Ruth killed it by stabbing its neck. Due to the tough crocodile skin, they only cut off the tail and took several pieces of meat. Back at camp, they cooked the meat on the wire grate over charcoal until it was crispy on the outside and tender inside. The crocodile meat, rich in protein and firm yet not greasy, was their meal. After eating, they slept until 8 a.m. the next day. Michael and Ruth then pushed their car into a sunny clearing, started a fire, and placed a spare tire on it to create a large amount of black smoke. They also used the car's rearview mirrors to reflect sunlight as a distress signal to pilots. When the rescue helicopter arrived, both the smoke and mirror reflections were clearly visible, marking the successful end of their challenge. The wetlands of Louisiana, USA, cover about 14 million hectares and are filled with alligators and water snakes. In this episode, a couple decides to take on the survival challenge. They begin with parachutes on their backs, hanging from tree branches, equipped with only 2 dragon-slaying knives and half a bottle of water. The couple spends some effort to free themselves from the parachutes and land on the ground. Michael plans to scout the area for dry land while Ruth stays put. Michael encounters a small alligator during his exploration. He breaks off a tree branch, uses it to engage the alligator, then circles behind to hold its head, and eventually secures its jaws shut. This alligator is enough for a substantial meal for Michael and Ruth, but they lack fire and water and haven't found solid land yet. After demonstrating his capture technique, Michael releases the alligator. Unable to bear the solitude, Ruth climbs a tree. When Michael returns, she cuts down the parachute. With just a couple of hours before dark, Michael decides to use the parachute to make a hammock to keep them off the dangerous water surface at night. They tie the parachute ends to trees and secure them with square knots. They spend the night squeezed together on the hammock. The next morning, after drinking their last sip of water, they pack up and set off to find a river. By noon, they reach land. The priority is to make a fire for boiling water to replenish energy before continuing their search for the river. Ruth's highly nearsighted glasses prove useful. Michael gathers dry leaves from the ground, crushes them slightly to make tinder, and uses the convex lens to focus sunlight on it. After patiently waiting for the tinder to smolder, Michael blows on it, and a flame bursts forth. Once the fire is strong, Ruth uses Michael's headscarf to filter out large impurities from the river water and fills a bottle. Michael uses a string to suspend the bottle over the fire. The plastic bottle doesn't melt due to the water's protection, and the water is boiled to kill any germs. While waiting for the water to cool, the couple cuts the parachute in half to make 2 hammocks and a waterproof roof for their shelter. Once the previously boiled water has cooled, Michael and Ruth rehydrate. They plan to catch crayfish in the swamp for dinner. While searching along the swamp's edge, they unexpectedly find a water snake eating an eel. Michael seizes this opportunity, pins the snake with a stick, and beheads it. The eel, rich in fat and protein, becomes their dinner, while the skinny snake is used as bait to attract crayfish. Ruth stays at camp to cook the eel, while Michael uses a bag made from the parachute to catch crayfish by the swamp. Soon, Michael brings back many crayfish to the camp. The cooked eel is fatty, very fragrant, and juicy. After finishing the eel, the lobster tails are also cooked. That night, a heavy rain suddenly falls, but the parachute-made roof protects them. By morning, the fire is still burning, and they are dry. Today, Michael plans to catch some large game to have a real feast. He cuts down 2 tree trunks of the right thickness, sharpens their tips into spears, and hardens them over the fire. Once ready, the hunt begins. They walk along the water's edge, looking for animals coming to feed or drink. Soon, Michael spots something moving in the water. Approaching, he discovers it's a wild boar. He jumps into the water, lunging at the boar, but a tree branch catches his helmet camera, and he watches helplessly as the boar escapes. He now returns to camp to dry his wet clothes. Though he didn't catch the boar, on the way back, he spots an opossum. He plans to knock it down himself and have his wife dispatch it. Michael quickly climbs the tree and pokes the opossum down with his spear. However, Ruth, who is afraid even to kill a chicken, fails to control it, allowing the opossum to climb back up. Michael goes back up the tree, pokes it down again, and pins it until Ruth overcomes her fear and kills it. On the 3rd night of survival, they eat the opossum. Michael grills it until it's crispy, making it very appetizing. Ruth cuts off a leg, bites into it, and praises the good roast, noting the smoky flavor that makes the opossum meat especially delicious. A starving Michael can't wait and begins to feast, enjoying the crispy chicken-like taste as they replenish their bodies with various nutrients. They eat well that night and sleep until the next morning. Michael packs up everything, digs a hole in a piece of rotting wood and places charcoal inside to keep a smoldering fire as they move. They continue eastward in search of a river. After walking 6 kilometers, they hear the sound of a motorboat. Michael quickly cuts a piece of the parachute, ties it to the top of his spear as a flag, and a motorboat appears in the camera's view, successfully ending this episode's challenge. 240 kilometers south of Australia, Tasmania Island has seen over 1,000 ships swallowed by its seas. Many people forced to survive on deserted beaches start their survival there. This episode, Michael and Ruth face such a challenge. Michael cuts the bottom of their raft with a knife, and they fall into the cold seawater. But before this, they had already packed spare clothes and a camera in plastic bags. After swimming to shore with the leaking raft and changing into dry clothes to prevent hypothermia, Michael finds a suitable camping spot nearby and prepares to survive and wait for rescue. In a land of weird rocks, he finds a spot shielded from the wind on 3 sides, with the open side facing the sun and the sea, a perfect spot for camping. Michael goes back to find Ruth. The couple packs up everything and heads to the spot Michael had found earlier. They use the leaky raft, securing it with rope at the top to complete their shelter. Before it gets completely dark, Michael plans to start a fire with a bow drill, ensuring they won't freeze overnight. He uses a curved tree branch as the bow, a knife sheath's rope for the string, and soft wood for the base and drill spindle. Ruth finds conical seashells to use as handles to apply pressure to the spindle. Together, they manage to start a fire. Ruth holds the shells to apply pressure, and Michael pulls vigorously. Soon, sparks appear, and they get the fire going before dark. That night, they go to sleep hungry. The next day, Michael prioritizes finding fresh water. He plans to build a solar still. He digs a hole, fills it with seaweed, and covers it with a plastic bag, securing the edges with stones. The sun evaporates the water from the seaweed, which condenses on the plastic. Meanwhile, Ruth is sent to the beach to find shells to hold water. The shells she finds are perforated, so she returns with a large bundle of seaweed instead. Following local indigenous methods, they sharpen sticks to string the seaweed into a bowl shape. After several attempts, they successfully create a seaweed bowl and place it at the bottom of the pit. They put a stone on the plastic above to direct the dripping water into the bowl. The distilled water is limited, so Michael must also search for a freshwater stream. He heads inland, and after walking for some time, the vegetation becomes greener. On the ground, he spots animal droppings near a likely water source. As expected, he soon finds a small swamp. The water is contaminated with animal waste, posing a risk of bacterial infection. Michael uses his headscarf to filter out the larger impurities from the water, planning to boil it for drinking back at camp. Meanwhile, Ruth searches for food along the coast. Tasmania is one of the world's largest abalone exporters, which she hopes to find. Abalone shells resemble stones. Ruth finds a suspicious one and pries it open with a knife, discovering it is indeed abalone. The couple returns to camp with their finds. Michael with about 7.5 liters of fresh water, and Ruth with 2 abalones and several sea snails. Before eating, they must replenish their bodies with sufficient fresh water. Ruth goes to the solar still, lifts the plastic, finding about 200 milliliters of sweet-tasting fresh water. However, this small amount is not enough for their daily needs. Michael came up with the idea of boiling swamp water. He heated stones in the fire and then placed them in a seaweed bowl. The stones heated the water to a boil, making it safe to drink. Just after replenishing their fluids, the sky suddenly changed, signaling an imminent storm. They had to reinforce their shelter quickly by dismantling the raft's roof, placing a thick log as a horizontal beam across 2 stone walls, and setting up a frame with thinner branches on one side. They covered it with the raft and secured it with rope to form a roof, managing to strengthen their shelter before the rain. By then, the abalone by the fire was cooked. Ruth used a knife to peel the meat directly from the shell. Eating them quickly replenished their bodies with much-needed nutrients, especially since these were tastier than other wild foods. On their 3rd day of survival, their task was to find as much food as possible. Ruth searched the beach for protein-rich abalone and sea snails. Michael ventured inland for food containing vitamins and carbohydrates. The first thing he spotted was an edible grass, its roots rich in carbohydrates and with a fresh taste. Next, Michael found some coastal apples, rich in vitamin C and great tasting. Ruth, in addition to finding abalone and sea snails, also found raspberries near the beach. The resources here were incredibly rich. The food they gathered made up a full table: edible grass, coastal apples, large abalone, raspberries, and blueberries. Some abalone were still roasting on the fire. Michael and Ruth started with some grass roots as an appetizer, followed by roasted grass seeds. Australian Aborigines would grind them into flour to make bread, which tasted a bit like animal feed. That day, they finally achieved sustainable living and slept until 8 a.m. Michael and his wife went to the beach to set up a signal fire, as most rescue operations would start at this time. They needed to provide a clear sign for the rescuers. As the helicopter, arranged by the production team, approached, they heard the rotor blades and added fresh branches to the fire to create a lot of smoke, guiding the pilot to them smoothly, ending their challenge successfully. In this episode, the couple came to the Chihuahua Desert in northern Mexico. Michael and Ruth had to survive 4 days before a rescue team's helicopter could reach them. Finding a water source was their top priority. To quickly locate potential water sources, climbing to a high vantage point was undoubtedly a shortcut. Michael and Ruth climbed a nearby pile of rocks. From the top, they saw an oasis at the foot of a distant mountain, likely a depression retaining some water for plants to grow, so they decided to head towards that oasis. The Chihuahua Desert can reach temperatures up to 48 degrees Celsius during the day. To reduce sweat loss, they slowed their pace while traveling to minimize sweating. Michael spotted a barrel cactus on the ground. By sucking the flesh of the cactus, they could obtain a small amount of water. However, this cactus was rotten and no longer edible. Later, Michael found a healthy one in a pile of rocks. He cut it open to reveal moist flesh, unlike the dry one before. The first piece of flesh was for Ruth. Ruth said it tasted like a juicy potato. Under these conditions, they couldn't swallow the flesh, because digesting food also uses up the body's water. So, they sucked on the flesh like sugarcane, only extracting the moisture. They continued towards the oasis, constantly searching for cacti to hydrate along the way. Suddenly, a dried-up riverbed appeared in their view. a good place to look for water. If it had rained in the last half-month, there might still be water stored underground. The couple descended into the riverbed and saw many signs of flood erosion, but the ground was completely dry with no trace of fresh water. They reached the oasis hoping to find water, but the surface still looked very dry. Michael chose a lower area and tried digging. After digging about 30 centimeters, he gave up. Besides the soil becoming darker, there was no water. At this point, Michael had to resort to extreme measures for hydration. He cut open a barrel cactus and scooped out its flesh, then urinated on it. In desperate situations, recycling urine is an option. Ruth could hardly bear it and almost vomited. Michael, not wanting to waste it, consumed it all himself. That day, they didn't have enough time to make a fire. They just cleared a spot on the ground, laid down fresh branches and desert yellow flowers as a makeshift mattress, and slept through the night. The next morning, Michael took his equipment to go hunting, hoping to find rabbit holes or bird nests. However, after a long search, he found neither. As they were packing up to leave in search for water sources, Ruth saw a rat enter their camp. Michael killed it with a rock, then wrapped it in desert yellow flowers and packed it in Ruth's backpack, planning to roast it once they found a water source. Their plan was to head to the canyon across from them because its vegetation was greener and it was the lowest point, likely to have water. Along the way, they also searched for barrel cacti and any other moisture-rich plants for hydration. This time, Michael found a large spherical cactus. Despite its many thorns, its flesh was water-rich and tasty. By sucking the flesh of these cacti, they could replenish a significant amount of water before continuing on their journey. Following an animal trail, they stumbled upon a good discovery. Following it might lead them to an animal's den for food or possibly to a water source. They followed the animal trail without knowing how long they had walked when a dense vegetation area appeared before them. Michael wanted to dig a hole to see if they could find water. However, the result was once again disappointing as the ground was extremely dry. The search for water proved much more difficult than expected. Finally, Ruth couldn't hold on any longer. Dehydrated and suffering from heat stroke, she lost her ability to move. She felt a splitting headache and nausea. Seeing the serious situation, Michael quickly called a doctor from a kilometer away. After drinking mineral water with electrolytes and salts, her condition somewhat improved, and her body temperature returned to normal. After the doctor left, Michael wanted to make a fire to keep his wife warm and allow her a good night's sleep. He found an abandoned bird's nest to use as tinder. By rubbing 2 dry sticks quickly, he managed to create sparks after 2 failed attempts and successfully ignited the tinder to start a fire. That night, Michael roasted the rat, and Ruth's condition improved. On the 3rd day of survival, they aimed to find as much food and water as possible. Behind the camp on the animal trail, Michael spotted a rattlesnake sunning itself. Besides that, there was nothing else. He pinned the snake's head down with a stick and killed it with his knife. Back at the camp, he cleaned the snake and roasted it over the fire. The snake had little meat, so they had to crush and eat even the bones to get enough energy. After eating the rattlesnake, the day passed. Upon waking up, it was time to leave. The rescue helicopter was within a 32-kilometer radius of them. If they stayed in the low vegetation's shadow, the pilots could have a hard time spotting them. Therefore, Michael and Ruth climbed to the nearby mountaintop. As the helicopter approached, their challenge ended. In this episode, Michael and Ruth came to Utah's valleys. The 2,300-kilometer-long Colorado River, flowing through Utah, often sees people trapped in the wilderness after capsizing while rafting. The couple simulated such a predicament, swimming diagonally towards the shore after falling into the water to save energy, even though it took a longer route. After reaching the shore, they quickly removed their wet clothes and changed into jackets stored in their waterproof backpacks to prevent hypothermia. The backpack also contained a knife, toilet paper, and a scouring pad. The most pressing task was to quickly start a fire to warm up. Michael took out a battery from the radio, used the positive and negative terminals to ignite the scouring pad, and then easily started a fire with the flammable toilet paper. With clear skies, there was no need for a shelter from rain, but the wind was strong at night. The couple used tree trunks and fresh branches to build a windbreak. They boiled river water in their cooking utensil, thus solving the 3 essentials of survival besides food. The next morning, the couple set out to scout the surrounding terrain. They found sparse vegetation on their side of the river and were blocked by a cliff, making it a veritable dead zone. Thus, they had to abandon their camp, repack their equipment, and jump into the river to swim to the more lush opposite shore. They crossed the river as before, not swimming directly across, but aiming for a downstream point and letting the current assist them. After reaching the shore, Ruth was extremely cold. Unexpectedly, Michael discovered that the land they were on was actually a small island in the center of the river with insufficient food resources to sustain them. Consequently, they had to enter the water a third time. Eventually, after several challenges, they reached the riverbank abundant in plant and animal resources. They chose a grassy area by the river to camp. Fortunately, starting a fire was easy this time. Michael found a large patch of cattails, whose roots and white tender stems were edible. The river crossing had paid off as he pulled up a bunch and brought it back to camp, urging Ruth to try the sweet, crunchy white roots. Michael then used a dead tree as a tool to stun a bullfrog by the river, easily catching one about 1/2 kilogram in weight. While Ruth prepared to stew the cattail roots and bullfrog for dinner, Michael found 2 insect larvae in a rotting log. These larvae, rich in protein, were added to the dinner of cattail root stew with bullfrog and young insects. On the 3rd day of their survival challenge, they hadn't seen a single raft passing by in the river. Michael decided to head to the mountain behind them to see if there were any signs of human activity. After a trek, they reached the mountaintop but saw no signs of people. However, they found many yucca plants. The petals of the yucca were edible, crunchy, and tasted like soap, which is why Native Americans used crushed yucca root as soap. Moreover, the juice squeezed from crushed yucca petals could quench their thirst, making this plant extremely valuable. It was now high noon, and although Michael and his wife initially wanted to rest under the shade of trees and wait for the temperature to drop before foraging for food, the sudden calls of turkeys in the nearby bushes made it impossible for Michael to rest. He decided to hunt a turkey to improve their meal. He cut a sturdy branch for the bow, used a knife sheath capable of bearing 250 kilograms as the bowstring, and crafted a longbow. After a few minutes of practice, both Michael and Ruth could accurately hit distant targets. The couple then started hunting turkeys. However, the turkeys were very cunning and stayed in open grasslands, making it difficult for predators to approach unnoticed. From a distance, the turkeys sensed Michael and his wife and attempted to flee to another location. Michael, not one to give up easily, continued the pursuit until they completely lost track of the turkeys and reluctantly returned to camp. Unexpectedly, on their way back, Michael encountered a wild hare. He quickly took aim with his bow and arrow, but narrowly missed. The hare swiftly escaped using the bushes for cover. That evening, Michael and his wife had to continue eating cattail roots and bullfrog. Fortunately, these provided the necessary proteins and carbohydrates. After eating, they slept until 8 a.m., awakened by the sound of a speedboat's engine as it entered the frame, marking the successful end of the challenge. Aitutaki Island, located in the South Pacific's Cook Islands, is a beautiful uninhabited island. Michael and Ruth had to survive there for 4 days before a rescue boat could arrive. Finding a water source is crucial for survival on a deserted island. Given Aitutaki's equatorial location with high temperatures and humidity, Michael decided to explore the island's interior first. He found no freshwater streams, only dry leaves and branches everywhere, which would attract many mosquitoes and rats at night. Setting up a shelter inland was not ideal. The couple then moved to the coastline, where they spotted coconut trees. Choosing the shortest one, they knocked down a few coconuts. Michael chopped one open, and the first sip of coconut water went to his wife, Ruth, who enjoyed the refreshing and sweet taste. With their water supply secured, they found a spot on the beach with sand and shade to build their shelter. Michael constructed the shelter using 2 sets of tripods to support 2 sturdy logs, on which he placed branches from the pandanus tree to form an elevated bed. He then covered it with a layer of palm leaves for a mattress, completing the shelter. Next, it was time to start a fire. Michael found hibiscus trees on the island, a type of tree used for fire-making by Pacific Islanders for centuries. He decided to emulate this ancient wisdom using the fire plow method, generating heat by rapidly rubbing 2 hibiscus sticks together. When the temperature was high enough, it produced tinder, which he placed in dry coconut husk and blew into to ignite. Michael successfully started a fire before dark. The next day, they went to the seaside to look for food. The first creature they spotted was a flounder hiding under a rock, but it swam away too quickly to catch. In contrast, Sea cucumbers lying quietly on the seabed were easy to collect by simply bending down. Michael cut open a sea cucumber, revealing red roe inside that tasted like very salty pasta. He fed a large chunk to Ruth. After eating, they placed the sea cucumber back in the water, where it could heal and be reused. Michael decided to go back and make a spear, while Ruth stayed to gather seafood for breakfast. On the rocks, she found clams clinging to them. It took all her weight to pry these clams off. Michael returned to the island and carved 3 sharp prongs at the front end of a tree trunk. He then tightly wrapped the end with vines to prevent it from splitting, creating a trident. Meanwhile, Ruth not only found clams, but also a large sea urchin. When she returned to the camp, loaded with these finds, Michael had already set up the sunshade. The edible part of the sea urchin is the yellow gonads inside, which can be eaten raw. Michael nailed the edible sea cucumber meat on a plank, roasting it beside the fire along with the clams. The clams were undeniably delicious, fresh, tender, and smooth. As for the sea cucumber, Michael said it was juicy and tender like beef jerky, but he soon couldn't pretend anymore as it really tasted like chewing a rubber tire, bitter and tough to swallow. The couple quickly ate some coconut flesh to rinse their mouths. This food was not enough for their daily needs. Michael took his spear and went into the shallow sea to fish. He spotted a decent-sized eel but failed to spear it, letting it escape. The weather on the island turned gloomy with strong winds, making it hard for Michael to see underwater. He caught nothing and decided to make several torches for night fishing, as some fish are attracted to the light. However, he also prepared 2 traps to catch coconut crabs by cutting coconuts open to expose the flesh and tying them with coconut husk to stones placed at the entrances of the crabs' burrows. The scent would lure the crabs out to eat, but they couldn't drag it into their holes. When Michael returned to check, he could easily catch them. At night, the couple entered the shallow sea with torches to fish. Michael spotted the same eel from earlier, but again failed to spear it and accidentally extinguished his torch. Besides this eel, they saw no other suitable-sized fish. While the torch was still burning, Michael and Ruth hurried back to camp before it went out. Their hopes for a protein-rich meal now rested on the crab trap. Fortunately, when Michael checked, the coconut crab was still greedily eating at the entrance. He stabbed it with a knife, killed it, and roasted it beside the fire. Finally, the couple had the protein feast they had dreamed of, filling their mouths with food for the first time since landing on the island. This coconut crab provided over 1,000 calories per person. After eating and drinking their fill, they slept until 8 a.m. the next day. They had to start looking for new food to stave off hunger. Michael noticed white terns on the trees above, which lay their eggs directly on branches and do not fiercely protect their offspring. He simply climbed the tree and took the eggs. The couple divided their tasks. Ruth went deeper into the island to collect more bird eggs for breakfast, while Michael picked coconuts to store fresh water. Ruth first caught a land crab, then successively took 2 white tern eggs. She thought that was all for the morning's haul. But on her way back to camp, she spotted a coconut crab hiding in a tree hollow. Ruth extracted a smaller coconut crab from a tree hollow using a knife. She then spotted another crab in a different hollow. Ruth used a stick to poke it out and killed it with her knife. Smiling, she proudly showed her catch to the camera. This crab was larger than the first. Back at camp, Michael was surprised by her successful hunt. They roasted the coconut crabs directly on the fire and cooked bird eggs in coconut shells with water. The coconut crab was as tender and flavorful as before. After their meal, Michael cracked open a bird egg to find a fully formed chick inside, which made him feel guilty. However, survival was harsh, and he ate the egg, chewing and swallowing forcefully. After breakfast, Michael went fishing for the 3rd time, while Ruth found several conchs. Michael finally caught the eel he had been after. The eel, rich in fats, was very tasty and provided the energy they needed. The roasted conchs could be completely peeled from their shells, filling their mouths with meat. The eel, juicy with each cut, was exceptionally delicious, and provided fats that previous meals did not. The couple ate well that day. When they woke the next day, their challenge ended with the arrival of a speedboat arranged by the production team. This challenge took place in Alaska, the largest state in the U.S., known for its diverse wildlife and vast forests and tundras. The couple chose this location to simulate lost wilderness hikers, equipped with a variety of gear, including cutting tools, ice picks, crampons, fire-starting magnesium sticks, and rain tarps. The glaciers here had many deep crevices. Climbing to higher ground first, Michael and Ruth carefully surveyed the terrain to choose the safest route. Michael planned to travel along the edges where glaciers and rock walls met, heading toward lower altitudes to reach the coast for rescue. They had to be careful throughout, especially when encountering a stream formed by glacier melt, which was uncontaminated and safe to drink directly. After leaving the glacier and reaching rocky terrain, they removed unnecessary crampons and walked along the edge. At the end of the rocky mountain, they could clearly see the coast where rescue was most likely. However, a large forest lay in between, home to over 30,000 grizzly bears. Despite the danger, they ventured into the forest and soon found a patch of blueberries, which provided some much-needed energy with their sugars. At this time in Alaska, the daytime lasts for 17 hours. It is now time to rest. Michael wanted to find a flat area in the forest to set up a shelter and make a fire for the night. During their search, they encountered a large, dry tree hollow. In other places, this would have been a perfect shelter. But in Alaska, these hollows are definitely bear dens. Sleeping there would be very dangerous. Michael and Ruth had to continue searching without considering it, constantly making noise to remind the surrounding grizzly bears of their presence to avoid surprise attacks. Eventually, Michael found a large flat area in the forest with a thick layer of soft peat moss. They just needed to tie up their raincoats to create a roof and lay some leaves to separate from the moist ground. Next, they needed to make a fire to boil water and warm up. Although the trees around were very damp, Ruth used an ice pick to chop into the trunks, digging out dry wood for firewood. Michael then took apart his wife's sanitary pad and ignited it with a magnesium stick, successfully starting the fire. On the second day of survival, Michael picked a bowl of blueberries for breakfast in the forest, squeezed fresh water from the damp peat moss, and had a simple meal and drink with Ruth before setting off again. After an unknown duration of trekking, they emerged from the forest into a large open area. Michael noticed many birds flying low at the edge of the tree line ahead. He guessed the birds were feeding on something. As expected, when he and Ruth walked over, they found a stream at the forest edge full of riverfish ready to spawn. Simply throwing a stone could kill a fish. Michael filled his water bottle, then used the ice pick to catch a 3 to 4 pound silver carp. By the river, he and Ruth first ate the fish roe, then cut large pieces of fresh fish meat and started eating directly. After filling their stomachs, they continued through the forest towards the coast they had seen earlier. Finally, at around 2 p.m., the couple saw the coastline, and there was a buoy in the sea, indicating either fishing nets or crab pots. It would not be long before fishermen came to check their catch. Before that, their task was to survive. Michael found a cargo pallet washed ashore. They set up camp under dense tree shade, laid branches on the pallet for a mattress, and used the same rain tarp for the roof. As before, they easily started a fire using the sanitary pad as tinder. Now, the only remaining issue was food. Michael wanted to try catching some fish. The stream was not far from the coast. Risking an encounter with grizzly bears, they returned to the stream. Michael and Ruth each caught a fish with their ice picks and went back to the coast to start cooking dinner. Michael took care of the fresh fish, while Ruth was assigned to find some side dishes. Although she saw many mussels on the rocks by the sea, they already had fish to eat. Ruth did not pick them, but focused on the sea lettuce that had fallen on the mussels. She also found a lot of sea blight and gathered a large bunch of various types. Back at the campfire, Michael had already cleaned the fish head and guts. He wrapped the fish body in leaves and placed it in the fire to roast. While waiting for the fish to cook, they ate fish roe and the plants Ruth had gathered as appetizers. The sea kale soaked in seawater with roe was delicious. The sea blight naturally tasted salty. As for the fish Michael cooked, the wrapped salmon fell apart when removed from the fire. The intact fish was given to his wife, Ruth. Michael stuffed large bites of the hot fish meat into his mouth. It was rich in protein and provided plenty of calories. After dinner, the couple cleaned up the campsite to avoid attracting grizzly bears with the smell of fish. Unfortunately, they still heard grizzly roars near the camp that night and had a restless sleep. At dawn, Michael and Ruth's only goal was to create a signal for rescue. They collected a lot of wood on the beach and built a fire, throwing seaweed and fresh branches on it to create smoke, hoping to attract nearby people. Soon, the production crew's nuclear-powered speedboat entered the scene, marking a successful end to the challenge. This episode brought the couple to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee, home to over 200,000 hectares of wilderness. Michael and Ruth face this challenge where people often get lost close to the correct path. So, in such situations, it's best not to stray too far from where you first got lost, as it's easier to be found or hear passing vehicles. The couple's backpack contained only a camera, an old first aid kit, and a garbage bag with some plastic and an aluminum can. Michael's plan was to find a nearby spot with water and flat ground to wait for rescue. However, before that, he made 2 spears, as many black bears live in the Smoky Mountains. He cut 2 sturdy and tough branches and sharpened the tops into spears. Then, they headed downhill and finally found a wide, flat area above a stream a few dozen meters below, making it an ideal camping spot. They gathered many dry branches and leaves from around to build a fire. The old first aid kit contained a bottle of glycerin and a bottle of potassium permanganate. Michael had his wife pour a tablespoon of potassium permanganate into a plastic cup in the middle of the woodpile, followed by a tablespoon of glycerin. The chemical reaction between potassium permanganate and glycerin generated heat and ignited, allowing them to easily start a fire. Then it was time to build a shelter. They cut several tree trunks, tied their tops together with rope, and spread the trunks to form an oval skeleton. They used the plastic bag to cover the top as a rainproof roof, filled the ground with pine needles for a mattress, and cut branches with large leaves to cover the sides of the shelter from top to bottom, completing the shelter. The next morning, Michael went hunting with a spear, as nocturnal animals were returning to their nests and diurnal animals were coming out to forage, increasing the chances of a successful hunt. After searching, he found a small turtle on the ground, but decided to release it instead of eating it, resulting in an unsuccessful hunt. Michael and Ruth then entered the jungle to look for edible plants. They found bear corn on the leaf-covered ground, which Michael knew was edible from growing up in these mountains. They collected a large amount and roasted it over the fire back at camp, enjoying a satisfying meal. Ruth commented that the bear corn looked like corn but didn't taste like it at all. They had slept poorly the night before due to worries about bears. But now, well fed, they just waited for rescue and took another nap to keep their minds sharp. In the afternoon, before it got dark, they went to the stream to look for dinner. Finding no animals coming to drink, they targeted crayfish and newts in the stream, which were easy to catch. Michael continuously caught them, cleaned them, and skewered them on sticks to roast over the fire for a simple dinner. The newts were crunchy with lots of bones and tasted like chicken, but had protein content much higher than beef. After 2 days without rescue at the camp, on the 3rd day, Michael and Ruth decided to actively search for signs of human presence. They packed their gear and planned to follow the stream downhill, as small streams often lead to larger rivers and nearby villages. On their way down, they encountered an open space that seemed like an abandoned farm with a central apple tree. The couple picked and took many apples and continued exploring the open space. Ruth, with sharp eyes, spotted wild strawberries on the ground that were fully ripe and very sweet. These strawberries were not only nutritious but also free of any toxic plants that resembled them. The couple gathered all the strawberries as snacks for the road. While they were happy with their continuous finds in the open space, suddenly a black bear emerged from the bushes ahead, stopping less than 50 meters from Michael and Ruth by a tree. The atmosphere became tense instantly. Fortunately, the bear showed no interest in them, stayed briefly, and then disappeared into the nearby bushes. After exploring the open area, Michael and Ruth followed the sound of water back to the stream, where they encountered an abandoned cabin. As it was getting late, they ate some apples and spent the night in the cabin. The next day, they continued down the mountain along the stream. The stream's flow increased and led them to a waterfall. There was no path around it, but fortunately the waterfall cascaded in steps, allowing Michael and Ruth to climb down gradually. After leaving the waterfall and returning to flat ground, they found an inhabited cabin, marking a successful end to their challenge. This episode took the couple to Dominica in the Caribbean, an island covered by dense jungles and largely undeveloped, with 80% still unexplored. Michael found ripe cocoa fruits, which could be used to make chocolate, but in a survival situation, the entire fruit was edible. The couple gathered several cocoa fruits and soon found coconuts that had fallen to the ground, which were easier to collect than those hanging high up. They packed these up, aiming to store as much food as possible. Michael estimated they were about 16 kilometers in a straight line from the coast, too far to reach by walking in one day. In the afternoon, they saw a lake in the mountains, which could potentially lead to the sea if it flowed into a river. As they prepared to camp by the lake, a sudden downpour disrupted their plans. Michael led Ruth back up to the densest part of the forest, where they found a dry spot under a tree. They cut a large amount of fern leaves and branches, constructing a conical shelter around the tree, preparing for a damp and sleepless night. The next morning, Michael and Ruth drank some rainwater collected in banana leaves, planning to eat a coconut before setting off. They cracked it open to find a large, sprouted coconut. A spongy ball formed from the embryo absorbing the coconut water, which tasted very sweet and creamy. After replenishing their energy, they discovered that the lake they found was actually a caldera lagoon with no path leading downhill. To descend, they had to climb over a steep slope and return to the mountains to find a river. After wandering for some time, they encountered a scalding hot volcanic spring with a pungent smell. Michael sensed that it might help their survival. Later, they passed through a clearing in the mountains, where hunger prompted them to sit down and eat the cocoa fruits they had packed. Just below this flat area, Michael and Ruth bathed in the river. They then chose a spot on the opposite bank, filled with many vines and broad leaves, ideal for building a shelter. Michael decided to settle there for the day. The couple divided the tasks and gathered materials for the shelter. Michael used 3 trees as posts, first wrapping the thickest vines around them. He then tied thinner vines to the trees to prevent slipping, weaving back and forth to create a hammock-like framework. They laid leaves on top for a mattress and used a similar method to construct a roof. This created a shelter that was open on all sides. They had finished all the coconuts and cocoa fruits previously packed in their bags. With daylight fading, they went out to look for food. Although rarely visited, the island's resources were impressive. In the jungle, they found a banana tree with a bunch of green, unripe bananas. The volcanic spring they encountered earlier came in handy. Ruth used a coconut shell to carry river water. Michael used a rope to throw the bananas into the hot spring, where the high temperature would break down the starch in the bananas. Now, they could eat their fill. Bananas are rich in carbohydrates and taste somewhat like potatoes when eaten raw. After eating and drinking their fill, they packed the remaining bananas as reserve food. They slept more comfortably that night compared to before. Upon waking, they ate some bananas to fill up, then packed their bags and followed the stream downhill. After nearly a whole day of trekking, they finally reached the sea using the river. Unfortunately, cliffs blocked both sides of the beach. They wanted to search the coast for a village but had to climb over the mountains. With night approaching, they chose to camp on the tidal line for safety. Near the beach, Michael found a recently cut coconut in the jungle, suggesting people might return. He also noticed bamboo next to the coconut shells, excellent material for building. In the nearby jungle, Michael indeed found a dense patch of bamboo. The couple cut down a large amount of bamboo and brought it to their campsite on the beach. First, they made a bed on the ground using wood and leaves. They placed a thick log between 2 Y-shaped branches to serve as the ridgepole of the shelter. Then, they split the bamboo in half, cleared the nodes inside, and laid the halves with the outer side down and inner side up as a layer. They covered the gaps with another layer of bamboo, inner side down. The base also used a split bamboo to create gutters so that rainwater would flow into the gutters and eventually into a coconut shell at the end. Thus, they created a shelter that protected against rain, but not wind. Next came the challenging task of making fire. This time, Michael used a new method of friction with a rope. He split completely dry bamboo and placed tinder made from coconut tree bark and leaves inside. Then, he cut a groove on the exterior of the dry bamboo and drilled a small hole on the inner side of the groove. He also split a fresh bamboo stick. He tied shoelaces at both ends of the bamboo stick with natural joints preventing them from slipping. Michael and Ruth worked together, moving the stick back and forth in the groove to generate heat by friction. The generated embers would fall through the small hole and ignite the tinder on the other side. The friction eventually produced enough heat to create embers, allowing Michael to successfully ignite the tinder and start a robust fire. For nearly 3 days, they had been surviving on fruits, and their bodies were desperately craving protein. Though they had coconuts picked from the coastline, they wanted some meat. Michael and Ruth found a stream in the valley and caught a few small crayfish and some snails. Back at camp, They put the seafood in a bamboo tube with water, sealed it with palm leaves, and heated it over the fire. While waiting for the food to cook, Michael cracked open a coconut to serve as a side dish. Before nightfall, they enjoyed a protein-rich meal. Despite the cooking being very simple, it was immensely satisfying for their meat-craving bodies and hungry stomachs. Michael and Ruth enjoyed their meal greatly. Because this part of the coast showed fresh signs of human activity, they knew it wouldn't be long before they were discovered, marking the end of this challenge. This time, Michael and Ruth arrived in the snowy lands of Alaska. Their snowmobile broke down unexpectedly. Walking into the snowy expanse, each step left a deep imprint. They cut the tracks off the snowmobile and tied them to their shoes to make snowshoes. It was early spring. The daytime temperatures were bearable, but at night, they dropped below freezing. The second issue was food. The area only had bare trees, and the animals were still hibernating. As for water, eating snow was sufficient. Ruth thought eating snow would lower their body temperature, but Michael, drawing on his experience, told her that it helps maintain body heat and prevents sweating and chills. They stood on high ground, which made it easier for passing pilots to spot them. They also planned to build a shelter. The sled was dismantled, and its parts were used to make shovels. They used these shovels to pile up snow. Ruth rolled on top of it to compact the snow. The two decided to start by making a fire. Starting a fire by friction was difficult in this weather, so they ignited the sled's fuel. Now they could begin digging their temporary dwelling. Michael dug a hole big enough for both of them to lie down. It was already 10 p.m., but the sun had just set in Alaska. After 16 hours of continuous physical exertion, they were exhausted. Although the fire at the entrance provided some heat, it was still cold. Ruth worried it might collapse and bury them. Michael used a dismantled fan cover as a container and melted snow over the fire to pour into it. Ruth used an oil tube as a straw, saying it was more sanitary, but it tasted of gasoline. Michael spotted some birch and red pine trees. The inner bark of these trees was edible, though bitter. Native Americans had once survived on this. To improve the taste, Michael toasted it over the fire, making it crisp like chips. However, this small amount of bark was not enough to fill them. Michael decided to go fishing in the river. Due to rising temperatures, the snow was softening and the snowshoes were less effective. Ruth slipped and slid like an eel. Suddenly, she screamed as the snow shifted, nearly causing her to fall through. Michael chopped a stick, tied a line to it, and used a stolen feather as bait. He cast the makeshift fishing rod, but it hooked onto an iceberg instead. Ruth had to go down personally to untangle it since it was their only fishing rod, but their efforts went unrewarded, and they returned empty-handed. That night they returned to the snow cave, but large chunks of snow had already fallen off. They barely made it through the night. The next day, Michael remembered there was an airport nearby. They decided to head there, using a fungus to make a portable firebox. They followed the snowmobile tracks toward the airport. Michael's body started to sway as his strength waned. After several hours, they reached a small creek. Michael struggled to cross and collapsed in the snow on the other side. After a moment of calm thinking, he told Ruth they had to stop. Reaching the airport was no longer possible. He took the firebox from Ruth, found some leaves, and started a fire. The warmth was comforting. They then cut some branches to make a shelter and spent another night huddled together. In the morning, the last flame had died out. Michael felt he had reached his limit and could not make it to the airport. Reluctantly, they decided to give up on the challenge. After announcing their failure, the cameraman immediately contacted the crew, who brought sleeping bags and started a fire. 20 minutes later, a helicopter arrived, and they were saved. If this had not been a challenge, they might have disappeared in the forest like others before them. This marked the end of the challenge. Michael and Ruth were camping in the remote northwestern part of Louisiana. They faced the worst forest fire in 20 years. With over 100,000 forest fires occurring annually, they knew the risks but still entered the forest. Unfortunately, a fire broke out. Michael rushed into the tent to save items, but most equipment was burned, and he could only save some tools. Knowing fires spread with the wind, they moved perpendicular to it and kept an eye on the dense smoke. The two raced against the fire and reached a mud pond, their campsite for the night, where they could jump into the water if needed. By early morning, the fire had caught up, spreading rapidly. They quickly grabbed their bags and fled as the fire engulfed the trees. After walking for about 2 hours, they found another mud pond. They planned to boil pond water for drinking, surrounded by raging fires. Surprisingly, Michael started a fire with a lighter. As the wind shifted, he used a counterfire strategy, directing the fire towards the ongoing wildfire. Ruth quickly extinguished the fire on their side, preventing it from spreading to unburned areas. This allowed the fire to burn towards the forest fire until the fuel was exhausted, creating a safety zone. However, a thick smoke emerged, indicating a larger, faster-spreading fire, forcing them to leave immediately. But they encountered a ring-shaped fire that surrounded them. Trapped by flames on all sides, they stayed put but didn't give up. Fortunately, the forest had many mud ponds. Michael used these damp materials to build a fireproof shelter. Before the fire approached, he dug a deep pit, wetted wood, and made a standalone base with branches and a crossbeam for insulation, then covered it with pine-mixed mud. The mud protected them from the fire and insulated against the heat. After finishing the mud cover, dense smoke reappeared with the fire 150 meters away. Michael prepared another safety ring for double protection. They rolled in the stinky mud pond to lower their body temperature, prevent burns, and keep their clothes from igniting. After these preparations, they hid in the mud shelter. The dense smoke darkened the sky, and Ruth's eyes teared up from the smoke, causing lung pain. Her biggest concern was whether the huge pine trees would fall and crush them in the fire. The fire eventually extinguished, and they succeeded but were exhausted. They decided to rest and start a fire on the spot, which Michael said would be the easiest fire to start this time. On the third morning, it started raining. They took shelter in a hut, cold and wet from the weather. Now that the danger had passed, they prepared to head to the nearest town, despite many trees having fallen around the pond. Suddenly, Michael excitedly shouted for Ruth as he found a charred armadillo, which would be their first meal in 3 days. However, Ruth refused to eat it, pointing out that armadillos are the only other animals besides humans that can contract leprosy. With no other options, Michael started a fire and planned to make a cup of pine needle tea, Ruth's favorite wilderness drink, before she returned. They skewered the meat and grilled it. Days of fleeing and fatigue were finally put aside. It was Ruth's first time eating this. It was very fatty and somewhat tasted like crocodile meat. On the 4th day, they left the campfire as it was, making 3 arrow signs with wood and pine branches, and set off towards the town. Suddenly, Ruth's leg got entangled in a vine. With a gentle tug, a charred tree fell, fortunately missing them. Soon, they heard the sound of chainsaws nearby and excitedly made their way through the tangled branches, finally seeing a group of loggers. They were saved. This episode concludes with the couple mimicking tourists who were stranded at sea for a day due to a boat malfunction. They found themselves in the notorious Bermuda Triangle, a region with a history of numerous ship and plane disappearances. Michael could still see the reefs, indicating they were still on the continental shelf, no more than 20 miles from the coast. Staying on the boat and waiting for rescue was the best course of action. The boat owner would surely come looking for them once he noticed their overdue return. Their immediate task was to inventory the boat's supplies: a bottle of water, a knife, a hand fishing kit, a waterproof tarp at the bow with the rainwater inside it, and some leftover raisins. After checking these supplies, Michael, feeling seasick, forced himself to stare at the horizon to prevent vomiting and dehydration. Once he felt better, he and Ruth rigged the tarp as a sail, hoping to use the sea breeze to push towards land. The boat was barely affected, and instead they suffered under the harsh sun. Worse yet, at some point, 6 or 7 sharks appeared beneath them, somehow sensing their presence. Now, their only option was to maintain their balance to avoid being knocked into the sea and becoming shark food. The first day passed in tension and unease. At night, the temperature dropped sharply, and they used the waterproof tarp as a blanket to keep warm and sleep. On the second day, they had only a little water left. Ruth rummaged through a trash bag and found another bottle with some water left, totaling about 80 milliliters. Besides drinking, they now also had to consider food. Seafood was the only option. Ruth, being a better swimmer, volunteered to go into the sea to find something for bait. Michael stayed on the boat to look out for sharks, while Ruth dived in search of food. She eventually found a large conch and extracted its meat, which was plentiful enough for both eating and using as bait. Ruth enjoyed the conch, describing its taste as sushi with a layer of mucus. They ate part of it and cut the rest into slices for bait. With no sharks nearby, Michael used the conch meat as bait and caught a green fish. The liquid in the fish's eyes was a source of fresh water. They quickly drank the black juice from the fish's eyes to hydrate. The meat was eaten raw. After catching a few more fish, Michael tied the leftovers to a rope and submerged them in the sea to keep them fresh. Unexpectedly, this attracted sharks. Although Ruth spotted them in time, one shark lunged and bit the fish on the rope. Michael struggled with the shark, almost pulling it onto the boat, but the shark eventually bit through the rope and ate the fish. The greater concern now was their dwindling fresh water supply. Michael recalled the box of raisins found during their inventory check. These raisins had a thin film on their surface that could absorb water while blocking salt when immersed in seawater. They just needed to cover the bucket with a lid and wait for the raisins to absorb water. By the third day, the raisins had fully expanded. Now, Michael and Ruth needed to squeeze them dry, but the amount of water was still insufficient. Michael decided to build a solar distiller using half a soda can as a water collector and a plastic bucket with a cloth strip soaked in seawater. They covered the top with plastic film and placed a weight in the center to channel the condensation into the can. After setting up the distiller, Michael collapsed from heat stroke and dehydration. Ruth used seawater to cool him down and set up a waterproof cloth as a sunshade. The water produced by the solar distiller was very limited and not enough for a person suffering from heat stroke and dehydration. Michael insisted Ruth drink it while he resorted to a last-ditch hydration method. They collected dirty rainwater from the front of the boat. Michael had Ruth administer an enema using a fuel hose with a squeeze pump, cleaned with seawater. They applied sunscreen lotion to the hose tip. Michael's intestines could hold up to a liter of water, from which he could absorb some. The rest would be expelled. After this ordeal, Michael felt somewhat better the next morning. He resumed fishing for breakfast, but a shark stole his catch again. By noon, a rescue plane appeared, ending this episode of their challenge. In this episode, Michael and Ruth ventured into the Amazon rainforest in Colombia. They simulated a scenario where they rented a local villager's canoe for a short trip in the flooded rainforest and accidentally got lost. Michael planned to find a river and follow its flow to the wider Amazon for rescue. However, due to flooding, the forest floor was submerged, and they had to paddle in a chosen direction to search for open waters. Upon reaching an open area, Michael checked the boat's supplies and found a filled water bottle, a packaged mosquito net, and a fire-starting kit left by the boat captain. The couple continued paddling, hoping to find land to camp on before dark. Along the way, they had to be vigilant of snakes, insects, and ants falling from trees to avoid getting bitten. Michael used dead reckoning to avoid circling back in the same area. After hours of paddling, both were exhausted and hadn't seen any fruit trees. Michael chopped into a rotten log and found a fat grub, followed by 3 rhinoceros beetle larvae from the wood debris. Since they couldn't make a fire, they had to eat them raw. Michael showed Ruth how to twist off the bitey heads and eat the fatty, nutritious parts directly. Ruth, after a brief hesitation, chewed and swallowed the larvae, later noting they tasted surprisingly good, with a smoky and buttery flavor. They didn't find land all day. As dusk approached, Michael found an area of water and tied the hammock between 2 trees, covering his wife with the mosquito net to sleep while he stayed on the boat to bail out incoming water, taking turns keeping watch through the night. The next day, they packed up and continued their search for land or a river. It wasn't long before a sudden downpour began. Fortunately, their water bottle was empty, and the rain was timely. Michael and Ruth used a raincoat to collect water, quickly refilling their water bottle. By noon, they finally spotted land for the first time during the challenge. Michael decided to use this land as a base to camp, make fire, hunt, and replenish their needs before seeking rescue. The first step was to start a fire. Since the ground was wet, Michael built a ventilated fire pit with branches to help dry the ground for sustained burning. He used the driest branches from trees without leaves for kindling, and Ruth shaved splinters with a machete for tinder. Michael then took the captain's fire-starting tools and began the fire-making process. Despite having a complete set of tools, the humid air made it challenging, and after 45 minutes of friction, he still hadn't seen any smoke. He quickly called Ruth over for help. Using the cap of the water bottle as a spindle to press down on the drill shaft, he had Ruth rub her hands together to create friction. With the spindle adding pressure, sparks finally appeared. Michael blew gently to ignite the tinder. and then they added small twigs and larger sticks to build up the fire. That night, they dragged the boat ashore to use as a shelter and managed to get a comfortable night's sleep. On the third day of survival, just as they were about to activate a passive skill, Michael tied the mosquito net between two sticks to make a net and walked to the water's edge at the campsite to catch fish. To their surprise, the first sweep of the net brought up two unidentified small fish. Fortunately, the Amazon River has good fish resources. Over the next few nets, Michael caught two catfish, and they used the catfish guts in the net to catch several carnivorous tiger fish. After a few attempts, they had enough protein-rich ingredients for a meal. They cleaned the fish and cooked them over the fire. The couple eagerly devoured the meal due to extreme hunger, even praising the usually unpalatable catfish. With the intake of various nutrients, their strength gradually returned. The couple had not yet explored this piece of land. They wanted to look carefully to see if they could find a river to follow back to the Amazon River. Michael and Ruth found a body of water. By observing leaves thrown into the water visibly drifting, they determined it was a river and not stagnant floodwater in the rainforest. The river was about 200 meters from their camp. To avoid the possibility of losing this spot by taking a detour, they simply dragged the boat to the river and followed the downstream flow. After an unknown amount of time, they heard the sound of a boat's horn in the distance and followed the sound to finally reach a wide river and saw the boat that made the noise, successfully ending this challenge. Andros Island is the largest of the Bahama Islands, formed by coral reefs exposed as sea levels fell thousands of years ago. The island is covered with dangerous limestone sinkholes. In this episode, the couple will take on a challenge here. They were dropped on the uninhabited mangrove swamps of the island, with the goal of heading north to seek rescue where people live. The first challenge facing Michael and his wife was to cross the dense mangrove swamp, because any step might land on a sinkhole, potentially disastrous. Therefore, they had to carefully hold on to trees and move slowly until they found a spot on the ground. From there, they began to cross the entire mangrove swamp and walked until 5:30 p.m. Seeing no end in sight, Michael decided they would spend the night in the mangrove forest. The couple climbed up a tree to find a spot to sleep. The next morning at 6 a.m., just as it got light, they set off again. As the trees around them changed into American silk cotton trees, the couple knew they were headed in the right direction. By noon, they finally reached a solid expanse of open ground. Their supply of fresh water was almost depleted. The straight-line distance across the island was about 40 to 50 kilometers. Now they needed to pick a spot here to make fire, boil water, and build a shelter, storing enough food and water before setting off again. Michael found a spot under a bush with dense branches to use as a shelter. Ruth went to a swamp they had passed on their way here, pulled out a clump of grass roots, and used the hole as a filter to obtain the fresh water they needed. However, this water needed to be boiled before drinking. Michael found suitable wood to use as a drill shaft and base, while Ruth collected fluffy seed heads and small twigs to make tinder. They used shoelaces as ropes to create an improved version of a double-handed bow drill. Due to the rudimentary conditions, the drill shaft was not smooth enough, and after more than an hour, they still hadn't seen any smoke. This frustrated Ruth on the spot. Michael then chose another piece of wood, and after more than 3 hours in total, he polished the wood to finally get it to produce embers and struggled to start a fire. With little time left in the day to go hunting, Michael ventured into the jungle to find edible plants to stave off hunger. He found a dying palm tree, peeled off the inedible outer leaves, and pulled out the palm heart from the center. The palm heart was crunchy and rich in carbohydrates. On his way back to the shelter, Michael noticed wild pig tracks and a dried-up mud pit on the ground, deciding to try and catch a wild pig the next day. Back at the shelter, he shared the palm heart with his wife, Ruth, who found it delicious. By 9 a.m. the next day, Michael had made the components for a pig trap. He used shoelaces to tie a noose that could hold up to 500 pounds. He went to where he had seen the pig tracks the day before, bent a small tree as a spring, and set the trap at the edge of the bushes using white palm leaves as bait. Once the pig stepped in, it would trigger the mechanism and be caught by the noose. Afterwards, Michael and his wife returned to the campsite and sharpened 2 tree trunks into spears, planning to actively hunt for the wild pig. Initially, both set out to hunt together, but Ruth was startled by sinkholes and sharp branches around her, causing Michael to lose his temper and argue with her, sending her back to watch the fire. Later, Michael found an animal trail in the jungle. likely made by a wild pig, judging by its size. He followed the trail, and indeed encountered a yellow-haired wild pig. Unfortunately, he didn't watch his step and fell into a hole hidden in the ground, injuring his shoulder. Michael tried to climb out using a tree by the hole, but his shoulder injury made it difficult to exert strength. Until it was nearly dark, Ruth noticed her husband hadn't returned. Realizing something was wrong, she went out to look for him and found Michael trapped in a hole. Both of them exerted effort to help Michael climb out. It was another hungry night for them. The next day, they took spears and went to check the trap. Michael eyed the distant vultures eagerly. After approaching the trap, they found a wild pig caught. Michael dragged the pig from under the shade and pinned it down. Ruth held its head while Michael stabbed it in the heart, killing it instantly. They then hung the pig up on a nearby tree for cleaning. The unwanted organs and head were left for the island's vultures, and the rest of the meat was taken back to camp. They cut some lean meat and made skewers with the pig's organs. Michael and Ruth enjoyed the meal, replenishing their strength after days of hunger. Now, with sufficient water and food, the couple, full and satisfied, carried the entire pig and headed north towards the inhabited part of the island. By 4 p.m., they encountered a lake formed by sinkholes. Initially planning to camp there for the night, they were lucky to find a fisherman by the lake, ending their challenge successfully. For this season, Mikel and Ruth decided to take on a challenge on Montserrat, a British overseas territory. Since 1995, the Soufriere Hills volcano has frequently erupted, making the southern part of the island uninhabited. Their starting point was directly in the path of the volcano's eruptions, so they needed to leave quickly and head to the mountain opposite to find an abandoned village to camp in. The couple, carrying nothing but their clothes, ventured into the mountains where they found a creek in a valley. With no supplies, Mikel and Ruth risked drinking the stream water directly. By 5:30 p.m., they reached the mountaintop and could see many abandoned houses on the opposite slope, which would be their supply station. When they arrived, it was already dark, preventing them from checking if the houses were safe. They had to make do with sleeping on a sofa for the night. The next day, Mikel planned to scout around for food and water sources. Fortunately, the area had domestic poultry left behind by humans. For water, a more pressing need, Mikel found fresh water stored in plastic bottles and some unfinished rum in the kitchen, left by the evacuating homeowners. They moved the found water and iodine outside, using the iodine to purify and disinfect the water by adding a suitable amount to it. The couple then divided tasks. Ruth went to catch a chicken for food, while Mikel tried to start a fire. But the house had many tools left behind that could be utilized. Mikel planned to create a fire piston using these tools, based on the principle of generating heat through compressed air to ignite tinder. He found a mallet and a sealed steel tube that fit perfectly together. Mikel coated the mallet handle with vegetable oil for lubrication, then drilled a hole at the bottom and inserted a small piece of cloth as tinder. Next, insert the hammer handle into the steel tube and repeatedly compress the air to generate heat. After some time, the heat ignites the cloth. Mikel uses the spark to light the tinder and then moves outside to start a fire. Meanwhile, Ruth chases a chicken into an empty house and successfully captures it by covering it with a cloth. Ruth plucks and cleans the chicken outdoors while Mikel finds a grill and utensils inside the house. They roast 2 large plates of chicken meat. Mikel and Ruth enjoy a protein-rich meal on the lawn. The chicken provides enough food to fill their stomachs and over 1,000 calories each. That night, they have enough time to set up their beds and sleep on a soft spring mattress. On the 3rd day of survival, Mikel plans to send a distress signal because they saw a helicopter the day before. Although the pilot did not see them, Mikel guesses the helicopter was monitoring volcanic activity. Today, he prepares to make a radio transmitter to send a distress signal to the helicopter. Ruth's task is to find a car battery in the nearby houses, while Mikel looks for wires, a grounding device, and metal to connect the battery terminals. Ruth finds a dusty car battery in a storeroom of a house. Mikel successfully finds the other 3 components needed to make the radio transmitter. He ties the wire on the balcony as an antenna, with one end attached to the positive terminal and the other grounded. By connecting another metal piece to the terminals, Mikel creates a current that cuts through the static air. Any nearby antenna can receive the signal. Mikel sends the signal in Morse code, hoping the helicopter pilot hears it. Ruth does not just wait. She finds a tamarind tree nearby with unripe, sour fruits. Mikel sends the distress signal for over an hour. Just as he and Ruth return to the house to gather supplies and plan for the next day, they hear the helicopter's rotors. They quickly run to an open highland and are successfully spotted by the pilot, completing the challenge. In Panama's Pearl Islands, with nearly 90 uninhabited islands, mostly made of extinct volcanic summits, the couple decides to take on a challenge. They start on a rocky beach, where Ruth deduces from the driftwood and plastic debris that the beach is below the tide line, making it unsuitable for camping. They must risk climbing the cliff in front of them, crossing the island to a beach on the other side to plan further. Finding water is absolutely crucial. Fortunately, tropical islands usually have water vines. Michael, leading the way with a machete, also tried to find this type of vine. However, it was not a good start. The vine he cut released a white sap, clearly not the water vine they were looking for. But there's bad news and good news. They found a paperbark tree along the way. The inner layer of the bark of this tree can be easily peeled off and is suitable for use as tinder. Ruth collected some and put it in her pocket. As night approached, they still hadn't left the dense jungle of the island. Michael found a large tree with a dense canopy, where he planned to spend the night, using branches and leaves to make a mattress. Ruth cleared the ground to check for hidden snakes and insects. While chopping the tree trunk, Michael found the water vine, solving their urgent need for water. Because there was no fire, sleeping in the jungle was a torment. After dawn, they cut several water vines to carry with them as they continued towards the other side of the island. With the treetops ahead brightening, the couple knew they were not far from the coastline. Indeed, this was the case. Michael climbed a tree and saw that the beach to their right was suitable for camping. So they headed in that direction and reached the beach by 2 p.m. Looking across the beach, they didn't see a single coconut tree. Michael and Ruth decided to set up their camp on a shaded part of the beach above the tide line. They had an unexpected find. Michael discovered a row of banana trees by the coast. Unfortunately, none of the 7 or 8 trees bore fruit, but they were still useful. Michael cut the base of a banana tree with his knife, revealing that the trunk contained a lot of water with a hint of banana flavor. He then dug a hole at the base of the banana tree and just had to wait about 30 minutes for fresh water to filter into the pit. Leaving the banana grove, they encountered a beach littered with trash. They found a good coconut among a pile of empty ones, containing up to half a liter of coconut water, rich in electrolytes and various minerals the body needs. The couple collected a pile of useful materials from the trash and brought them back to camp. Michael tied up a tarpaulin to create a roof and laid banana leaves on the ground to separate them from the sand, quickly finishing a simple shelter. As for the most troublesome task, making fire, he had previously found a screw cap and something resembling a roulette wheel in the trash. Using these, he made an improved version of a hand drill. By leveraging balance and centrifugal force, he easily drilled out tinder and started a fire. That night, they had to make do with eating coconut meat, but coconut meat is also a good source of protein, fat, and carbohydrates. Day 3 of survival. Early in the morning, Michael and Ruth planned to build a seawater distiller. Michael started another fire and built a stand over it, placing a bucket of seawater on top. Meanwhile, Ruth was tasked to find a piece of plastic from the debris. They cleaned and secured the plastic at all 4 corners. As the seawater boiled, the steam condensed on the plastic, forming droplets that slid down, guided by a stone at the plastic's end, into a cup below. Now, with water secured, they still needed to solve their food source. Earlier, Michael had found a piece of fishing net on the beach, and, with Ruth, set the net in a mangrove area in shallow waters, hoping to catch passing fish and shrimp. While waiting for the net to yield results, they took proactive steps. Ruth searched the island for wild food, and Michael, using found nails, made 2 spears and went fishing by the shore. He noticed many stingrays in the sand, but catching them was challenging due to the limited power of throwing spears. Whether they would have meat tonight depended on the net. Fortunately, the nets did not disappoint, catching a black, unidentified fish that looked non-toxic and became their dinner. Earlier, Ruth had found an orange tree on the island, harvesting several tangy green oranges. Using these 2 ingredients, he made a citrus-marinated fish, eating it directly soaked in orange juice. They slept until 8 a.m. the next day. Due to the tide going out, the nets caught no fish overnight. Michael and Ruth focused all their energy on catching stingrays. At this moment, the production crew's boat arrived. Michael quickly lit a prepared pile of plastic creating a large plume of black smoke to attract the crew's attention, successfully concluding their survival challenge. In this episode, Michael and Ruth ventured into the San Stodoro Mountains in Southern California to explore for gold. Their donkey, carrying equipment, ran away, forcing them to survive with just an iron rake, a water bottle, a knife, and a jacket. The highland desert environment posed a significant problem with water scarcity. They climbed to the mountaintop to survey their surroundings. Michael spotted a dense forest in the valley, hoping to find water there. After a tough trek, they entered the valley. Although they found no running water, there were some remaining patches of snow they could use as a water source. Michael chose a spot on the hillside to make camp. Ruth collected branches for bedding while he searched for fire-starting materials. He found a piece of flint, which could strike sparks with his iron rake. Before leaving, Michael had filled his water bottle with high-proof whiskey, which now soaked the tinder, aiding in easily starting a fire with the sparks. After dark, Michael built 2 long fires, and he and Ruth slept between them to keep warm and melt snow for water. They survived their first night smoothly. The next morning, Michael made pine needle tea, which Ruth praised for its delicious taste. After extinguishing the fire and packing up, they continued down the valley, breaking branches along the way to leave traces for rescuers. It wasn't until the afternoon that they found a small stream. Michael dug a hole beside the stream with an iron shovel to filter the water before boiling it over a fire. They set up camp nearby in a spot sheltered by large rocks and abundant with acorns on the ground. Ruth collected these acorns for dinner. Michael used a sanitary pad as tinder, sparking it with flint to start the fire. He then went hunting with a helmet camera, hoping to catch rabbits or ground squirrels. First, he killed a wolf spider and stored it in his hat, then spotted a scorpion but found no trace of rabbits or ground squirrels. Meanwhile, Ruth crushed the acorns with a rock to remove the bitter tannins and placed some in a sock to soak in the stream overnight as breakfast. Unexpectedly, Michael heard noises in the bushes, thinking it might be a deer or a cougar, but found their runaway donkey instead. He led it back to camp. Ruth boiled the crushed acorns in a cup while Michael cooked the scorpion and wolf spider, first singeing the spider's hair. They tasted the scorpion first, finding it surprisingly crab-like and quite tasty. They filled up on acorn paste and slept soundly, but were disturbed at midnight by the restless donkey, likely spooked by something approaching in the dark. Michael stayed awake by the fire, suspecting a cougar, and let Ruth sleep. At dawn, indeed, he found cougar tracks not far from their camp, but chose not to worry Ruth with the news. The soaked acorns were mashed and shaped into cakes, baked on a shovel over the fire for a high-calorie breakfast resembling peanut butter pancakes. After breakfast, Michael hurriedly led Ruth away from the camp, aiming for lower elevations. By 3 p.m., their water was nearly gone, and they had not encountered any signs of other people. At the junction of 2 deep gullies, they tethered the donkey and searched for water separately. Ruth found only rabbit droppings, while Michael found moist soil but guessed it might require digging several meters, thus proving unhelpful. As night approached, they had no choice but to camp next to a rock. This time, Michael dug a rectangular pit and built a large fire in it. After the flames died down, he covered the charcoal with earth to create a warm bed that would provide heat throughout the night. They also built a fire nearby, ensuring a comfortable sleep. However, their fire inadvertently caught the attention of a farmer in the valley below, leading to an unexpected rescue. This challenge, located in the Blackfeet Indian Reservation in Montana, which spans 600,000 hectares of forests interspersed with grasslands and largely uninhabited, the couple, equipped only with a dragon-slaying knife, a half jug of water, and a full bottle of bear spray, decided to venture into this area. Michael planned to head downhill to find a stream where they could camp and wait for rescue, knowing that the Blackfeet Indian Festival was taking place nearby and that people would be collecting herbs in the wilderness after the festivities, offering a chance for rescue. Due to the presence of many black bears in the area, they needed to make noise while walking to alert the bears and prevent attacks. They walked until after 9 p.m. With the local daylight lasting 16 hours, managing rest was essential. Michael and Ruth found a flat area on the slope, laid down a layer of branches for a mattress, and took turns sleeping to guard against bear attacks. The next day's plan was still to find a water source, which Michael was confident would be at the base of the mountain. As expected, they found a stream at the bottom of the mountain. The water looked clean, but drinking it without boiling was risky. Michael preferred to start a fire and boil the water. The resources across the river seemed abundant, and they planned to cross over using fallen logs to camp there. Unfortunately, Ruth accidentally fell into the stream, which was very cold as it formed from melting snow on the mountaintop. Ruth quickly risked hypothermia, increasing the urgency for Michael to start a fire. He picked a campsite under dense branches with dry ground and began his fire-making task. Michael found several dry birch branches for kindling. Ruth, in dry clothes, went out to gather tinder to stay warm. Michael made a groove in the top of a spindle and used shoelaces to create thumb loops, preventing his hands from slipping and allowing more downward pressure during the fire-starting process. The base was simply 2 birch branches tied together. Ruth gathered some moss for tinder nearby. With the help of the improved hand drill, Michael successfully ignited the tinder and built a strong fire. Ruth warmed herself by the fire, and now it was time to consider food. She found nettle nearby, rich in vitamins and calcium. Selecting the tenderest parts, they cooked them for a nutritious meal. In addition to nettles, Ruth also found several thistles. Although their branches and leaves were full of thorns, once peeled, the stems inside were edible. They tasted somewhat like cauliflower stems. Today's progress was smooth. Entering the 3rd day of survival, Michael decided to move their shelter to an open area outside, making it easier to be spotted than hiding under the trees. However, before building the new shelter, they needed to gather food. Michael and Ruth cut many thin branches and used them to construct a fence across the stream. They then built a trapezoidal entrance upstream, making it easy for fish to swim in but difficult to swim out. Michael also found many small animals like rabbits and squirrels in the grass. He dismantled his shoelaces to create 2 noose traps. The principle was that if an animal tripped the noose, continuing to move would disrupt the balance of an L-shaped hook, causing a bent branch to spring up and tighten the noose, suspending the animal in midair. During the wait for the traps to work, they built the new shelter. Michael, imitating Native American techniques, stuck long, thin branches into the ground in a circle and tied the tops together. He bound several horizontal branches around the middle part for reinforcement and filled the entire framework with leaves to complete the shelter. When Ruth went to fetch water, she found that their fish trap had caught exactly 2 trout. After struggling in the river, she managed to catch the fish and killed them with a stone, jubilantly returning to show Michael her catch. Their cooking method was simple due to environmental constraints. They grilled the fish directly on a flat rock. Hunger being the best seasoning, Michael and Ruth were very satisfied with their meal. They each obtained over 500 calories from the fish. Though not much, it was comforting. After eating, they still had to take turns keeping watch and sleeping. The next morning, Ruth checked the fish trap again and found it empty. Therefore, Michael decided to make a weapon and actively hunt, also checking the noose traps they had set the day before. He chopped down a suitable branch and sharpened a stone with a sharp edge. He wedged the stone into a split at the top of the branch and tied the ends of the split tightly with rope. This setup not only secured the stone, but also prevented the split from widening. Originally, Michael intended to hunt in the grassland with this axe. However, one of the noose traps had caught a squirrel. Since the noose had tightened around its chest, the squirrel was not dead yet. Just as Michael was about to kill the squirrel, Ruth suddenly called out to him. She had seen 2 people on the opposite hillside while foraging for wild vegetables. The squirrel thus had a narrow escape. This challenge thus came to a successful conclusion. This couple came to the depths of the Appalachian Mountains in Kentucky. They removed their clothes and brought only a knife. Worse, Michael had a fever, making this challenge particularly difficult. Their survival plan was to head downhill to find a river and then follow the stream to find people. The forest hid many cliffs and steep slopes. A slight misstep could lead to a fatal fall. Faced with such terrain, the couple had to take detours. Michael, feeling unwell, relied solely on his willpower to keep going. Along the way, he found some goldenrod plants, whose petals could be used to make tea with fever-reducing properties. He tried some and found they tasted a bit like anise. At this point, Michael had to try to self-heal. By 4:30 p.m., the soil underfoot became moist. Michael noticed water seeping from the crevices in the rocks and guessed it was spring water, not accumulated rainwater, so it was likely uncontaminated and safe to drink. Near the spring, the couple found a protruding rock ledge, a natural shelter perfect for spending the night. Michael and Ruth cut some rhododendron leaves to lay on the ground and topped them with softer magnolia leaves to make a simple bed. On his way back after drinking water, Michael encountered a sourwood tree. Its leaves were directly edible. Although far from filling, they made a decent bedtime snack. After a night's rest, possibly helped by the goldenrod, Michael felt much better the next morning. While Ruth was still asleep, he went out to find edible plants for breakfast. Michael found some Virginia creeper berries, which were red all over with 2 small indentations on the surface and tasted a bit sour. Today, Michael planned not to continue traveling, but to make good use of the clear spring and find enough food nearby to replenish their bodies before setting off again. While exploring the area, they picked up several animal bones. Michael thought they could use these bones to start a fire. Ruth decided to try making a clay bowl to have a container for water. After splitting up, Michael found a bird's nest in the woods, perfect as tinder. Back at the shelter, he drilled a hole in a spindle with a bone and threaded the rope through it. This prevented the rope from slipping down during bow drilling, making it more convenient and less labor-intensive. Meanwhile, Ruth found a small pond where the clay could be used to make a bowl or a water jug. Besides, she discovered salamanders in the pond, which were easy to catch and could provide some protein. Michael successfully started a fire using the bow drill. He then joined Ruth by the pond, where he noticed several water lilies known for their edible taro-like tubers. Digging up a few could provide a hearty meal. Back at the shelter, Michael tossed the tubers he had dug up into the fire to roast. Ruth caught 7 or 8 small newts, cleaned them, and skewered them on a knife to grill. While waiting for these to cook, she used some clay she had found to shape a clay pot. After about 15 minutes, the lily tubers were cooked through, looking and smelling like sweet potatoes. Satisfied after their meal, Michael pulled out a small tin box from his pocket. Michael planned to use this tin box to make char cloth. He cut a small piece of his shirt, punched a hole in the tin box, and placed the fabric inside. He then put it in the fire to heat. The fabric wouldn't burn, but would slowly char. The resulting char cloth would ignite quickly, with just a tiny spark. On their 3rd day of survival, Ruth's clay pot, placed in the charcoal, was successfully fired. Before setting off, they drank as much water as possible, filled the small clay pot. Once everything was ready, they set off. The journey was challenging. A path estimated to take an hour on a map could take 4 to 5 hours here. In the afternoon, the couple found a nearly dried-up pond with plenty of cattails growing in it. With both water and food available, they decided to camp and make a fire overnight. Michael planted some bamboo stalks in the ground, bending them into an arched shape and tying the tops together to create a shelter that could protect them from the wind and rain. For starting a fire, he used crushed tops of the cattails as tinder this time. While Michael was making fire by friction, Ruth went to the pond to pull some cattails for food. The white tender shoots at the bottom of the cattails were good to eat raw, while the starchy roots were better roasted. Now, with all 4 survival essentials covered, food, water, shelter, and fire, they slept well and woke up at 10:30 the next morning. The water they had brought was all gone, and Ruth's clay pot had cracked. Michael thought of a new way to boil water from the pond. He asked Ruth to find some stones nearby while he dug a hole near the camp, lined it with his jacket, and placed some grass at the bottom for insulation. He surrounded it with stones for stability. Ruth found a turtle shell to use as a water container. They filled the hole with water and heated stones to drop into it, boiling the water to kill any bacteria. Once cooled, it was safe to drink. After quenching their thirst, they continued their journey. Along the way, they picked some poison ivy berries as snacks. At around 3 p.m., they found a dried-up riverbed. Following it, they saw tire tracks left by humans and successfully found a nearby road, completing their survival challenge. Croatia's Velebit Mountains feature dense forests and rugged high mountains with a complex network of caves below the surface. This episode's survival couple decides to take on the challenge here. During their caving adventure, their flashlight fails, leaving them with only a lighter, a first aid kit, and 2 dragon-slaying knives. Michael plans to find a breeze in the cave and follow the wind to exit. They wrap their cotton sweatshirt around a knife, pour some alcohol on it to make a torch, and use iodine as water purification tablets to sterilize the stagnant water in the cave. After resting overnight, at 9 a.m. the next day, they follow the wind and find the cave entrance, but emerge near the mountaintop, far from human traces. Michael realizes they are on the densely forested north side of the Velebit Mountains, near a minefield from the Crimean War era. Stepping on one could be very dangerous. After a brief rest, they carefully tread on rocky ground, climbing towards the mountaintop, planning to seek help on the southern side of the mountain range. Upon reaching the top, Michael spots a few beech trees with fruit. The couple eats some and fills their pockets with more. After reaching the summit, they see no signs of human activity or rivers. They decide to head downhill, hoping to find a river to replenish their water supply and follow the stream to seek rescue. They haven't gone far when Michael spots a dogberry tree ahead. Normally, red fruits have about a 50% chance of being poisonous, but Michael recognizes this as a non-toxic dogberry. The berries are sweet, juicy, and slightly peach-flavored. Michael also picks many as snacks for the road. The region's rocks are mostly fragile and sharp limestone, making the trek difficult. They finally take a break when they reach a large flat area. Michael initially looks for water, but a grouse eating on the ground catches his eye. He throws a stone at it, but misses. He quickly picks up another stone and throws it, startling the grouse into a nearby bush. Michael and Ruth go into the bush, but don't find the grouse. Instead, they encounter a small, high-nosed viper taking shelter from the heat. Considering its small size and the risk, Michael decides to ignore it and not pursue the grouse further. He opts to make a slingshot to hunt other game. Ruth stays to make a fire and set up camp. Michael cuts a Y-shaped branch and uses an elastic cord from Ruth's backpack. He uses a tag from his pants to create a pouch for stones, making a slingshot. After eating some beech fruits and dogberries to tide them over, Michael begins his hunting trip. After searching, he finds a grouse in the bush, and this time, his first slingshot shot hits the target. Michael returns to camp to show his wife their dinner. During this time, Ruth made a fire, prepared their bedding, and gathered some wild thyme nearby to use as seasoning. Michael plucked the grouse, cleaned its innards, and stuffed its belly with thyme and crowberries to enhance the flavor. After roasting, the grouse was crispy on the outside, and tender and aromatic on the inside. Michael couldn't wait and started eagerly eating a leg. The grouse was all lean meat with a dense and firm texture. After finishing their last bit of water, they slept until 8 a.m. the next morning. Michael and Ruth packed up their gear and continued down the mountain, passing through a low shrubbery to a steep, rocky slope over 200 meters high. Below the slope were the river and lakes they had longed to find. Michael found a slightly easier path down the slope and patiently helped Ruth overcome her fear. They carefully made their way down and reached a lake at the mountain's base. Without hesitation, they jumped into the lake to wash off the sweat and cool down. Michael quickly filled their water bottles and used iodine to disinfect the water. Meanwhile, Ruth found several fig trees by the lake, laden with blue fruits rich in sugar, a true treasure from nature for survivors. Michael picked many while Ruth gathered them. He then found a small cave at the base of the mountain nearby to use as a shelter, planning to make a fire there for the night. The rocky beach had plenty of dry branches for firewood. Michael walked to the shallow part of the lake to sift through the mud, hoping to find mussels. Their hopes were met as the shallow mud was teeming with freshwater mussels. The couple quickly filled their pockets and returned to the shelter to prepare dinner. They cooked the mussels on the fire, and when their shells opened, they knew they were ready. While waiting, they ate some figs as an appetizer to replenish their vitamins and sugars. The mussels were cooked through in a few minutes, appearing yellow and appetizing. However, the taste left much to be desired. Michael noted they must have absorbed a lot of water-soluble limestone, tasting somewhat like mud. Nonetheless, the protein was substantial, so they couldn't be choosy about the taste. That evening, the couple ate and drank well and slept comfortably. On the fourth day of survival, they followed the river downstream, passed through a dense reed marsh, and climbed over a steep, rocky slope. When Michael and Ruth reached flat ground again, they finally heard human voices. They approached and found several people camping, marking a successful end to this episode's challenge. This episode, Michael and Ruth take on the challenge of hiking in the Scottish Highlands, one of the least populated and harshest climates in the UK. The couple simulates being long-distance hikers lost in the wilderness. They find themselves at a high altitude with visibility around 50 meters due to dense fog. A strong wind from the west brings drizzle. Michael's plan is to head east to avoid the wind and rain and to find a river at the foot of the mountain. They hope to follow the stream to reach the coast and seek rescue. The plan is simple, but the execution is difficult due to cliffs, slippery wet ground, and low visibility, making it easy to fall and potentially fatal. The couple moves at a steady pace until around 4 or 5 p.m. Michael realizes they won't be able to leave the mountain before dark, so they start looking for a shelter to spend the night. Ruth finds a rocky outcrop that serves as a natural windbreak. Together, they gather more stones to build a windbreak circle and use moss to fill the gaps between the stones. Ruth fills their water bottle at a nearby spring, and they use water purification tablets from their first aid kit to make the water safe to drink after half an hour. That night, cramped under one raincoat, they weather their first challenging night in the wilderness. The next day, the weather improves and the fog clears. The couple continues downhill, now able to see a river and a forest at the base of the mountain, though they have to make a long detour to get there. They endure more wind and rain and reach the forest by 1:30 p.m. The area is home to small animals, allowing them to build a shelter in the forest, start a fire, and secure some protein to replenish their needs. The damp ground makes it unsuitable for a lean-to shelter, so Michael hangs a hammock and squeezes into it with his wife. They use the raincoat as a windbreak and roof to complete the shelter. Ruth collects dry moss from trees and grass tufts for tinder, along with flammable pine resin. This white, pure pine resin is edible, sugary, but sticky and wax-like. Considering the environment, Michael finds it hard to start a fire by traditional means. He plans to use a broken flashlight. He extracts the batteries, removes the outer casing to expose the thin wax paper that separates the battery's terminals. Michael positions a fish hook under the wax paper. Twisting the hook to make it touch the battery terminals creates a short circuit. Then, he rolls up a bandage from their first aid kit, uses the heat from the short circuit to light it, and then lights the tinder, ultimately creating a strong flame. Ruth takes over to keep the fire going. Michael plans to make a bolas to hunt rabbits in the area. He finds 3 stones of the right size and ties a secure cross knot around them. He then tightens the ends of the 3 ropes binding the stones, completing the bolas. Michael searches for areas with rocks and dense bushes where rabbits are likely to burrow or forage. After an unknown period of searching, he finally spots rabbit tracks. He swings the bolas, gathering momentum, and throws it, but misses by a slight margin. Michael attempts to chase, but cannot run as fast as the rabbit. Continuing the pursuit, he finds the rabbit hiding in a grass pile beside a stone. This time, his throw with the bolas hits the target precisely. Ruth takes the rabbit to the river to clean it, then skewers it on a branch and roasts it over a fire. After half an hour, the rabbit is cooked and looks appetizing. Michael and Ruth tear off a thigh and start eating. Rabbit meat has much lower fat content than other meats, offering a chewy, firm, and aromatic taste. On the 3rd day of survival, considering there are no trees by the seaside, Michael packs a bundle of firewood to take with them, hoping to reach the coastline by following the river. They come across a spot in the river with shallow water, a good place for fishing. They fold the hammock to minimize the mesh, and both hold it in the middle of the river. After some waiting, they actually catch a passing fish in the hammock. Unable to make a fire, Michael and Ruth eat the trout raw. By around 2 p.m., the couple successfully reaches the coast but finds it completely deserted. With no other options, they decide to walk along the coastline. After several more hours, they find a cave above the tide line with a man-made stone hut inside. Michael decides to make use of it and they spend the night there. He stays to make a fire while Ruth goes to the shore to find food. There are many cap shells on the rocks at the beach, feeding on algae growing on the rocks. Ruth also finds scallops, which are easier to pick. In no time, Ruth fills a water cup and a hat with seafood and returns to the cave. Michael, repeating his earlier method, starts a fire using a battery short circuit. They roast some of the mussels and cap shells and boil others in seawater, enjoying 2 different flavors of seafood. Both the mussels and cap shells are chewy. They have a hearty meal and sleep comfortably in the stone hut in the cave. At dawn, they continue walking along the coastline and encounter a family of 3, marking the end of this challenge.